Sometimes we have blended emotions, and that's when things start to get complicated. So we have our 6 basic emotions, and then we have countless emotions on top of that. Well, the problem is that we're complex creatures, and we can absolutely 100% experience blended emotions. So, for example, let's look at this guy on the left here. What I want you to do is I want you to take your hand and I want you to cover the bottom, the eyes, cover the top portion of this guy's face. What emotion is his mouth? What's his mouth and nose? Disgust, right? Okay, that wasn't too difficult, right? Now, I want you to take your hand and I want you to cover his nose and I want you to cover his mouth. What do his eyebrows and eyes tell you? Anger. Very good. So this is a blended face, right? Not only is he angry at you, but he's also absolutely disgusted with you. Okay? Ew. All right. If you watch Schitt's Creek, it'd be David. This is literally David's face the entire season, every season of Schitt's Creek. Okay. He's like, ew. Okay. I'm angry and I'm disgusted and I don't want to be here. Okay. That's Schitt's Creek. If you haven't seen it, it's hilarious. Okay. Now, so we can absolutely have blended emotion, and it starts getting really difficult because different parts of our face are going to engage in different reactions. Let's look at this chick right here. Okay. Let's cover her eyes. All right. And just look at her mouth. What's her mouth saying? Joy, happy. She seems happy about something, right? Okay. Now let's cover her mouth. What do her eyes tell you? Surprised, right? Terrified, slightly terrified. She's surprised. She is surprised here. Okay. We're going to call it surprise. I know it's difficult with the big eyes, with the fear and the surprise, but we're going to call it surprise because of these lifted eyebrows here. Okay. And because I told you so. So we're seeing somebody who is surprised, but also joyful. Oh, that's great news that I wasn't expecting. Okay. That would be an example of somebody with this blended emotion. Okay. Now, so we've got a pretty good handle on understanding communication and emotion and facial expression and the 6 basic emotions and all that. The question is, are these universal? Does that mean that for every single human, no matter where you are from, no matter where you grew up, no matter what experience you have, can you express and understand emotion just like anybody else? And it turns out, so that's what we mean by universal. It's not culturally specific, every human. Turns out that these 6 major emotional expressions, anger, happiness, surprise, fear, disgust, and happiness, and sometimes it's like A-E-I-O-U and sometimes Y, and sometimes, contempt, can actually be completely universal because they've done studies on this. And so Charles Darwin was big on sort of arguing that facial expression has an evolutionary significance, that we need to understand anger on people's faces and joy on people's faces because of relationships and also because of keeping each other safe and understanding emotional states for survival reasons. Okay. So that was Darwin's argument. And it turns out that he was right because Paul Ekman did a series of studies in the 70s where he went to indigenous tribes in different countries like Papua New Guinea and people who had never seen Western people, okay, and didn't understand the culture and had never been exposed to anybody. And what he did was he would ask them to he would give them pictures of people expressing different emotions and ask them what emotion the person was experiencing. And then so that would be understanding and reading emotion. And then he would also ask people to express emotion. And they were able to do the 6 basic emotions. So these are individuals who had never seen anybody in the Western culture before. And they were absolutely 100% capable of encoding and decoding these 6 basic emotions. So they were able to encode them, express them, they were able to decode them or interpret them with equal accuracy. And we also find that there are cases where these 6 basic emotions are the first to occur in human development. So think about it this way. You have a baby, the baby's just born, right? Do you sit with the baby and you're like, okay, when you're happy, what I need you to do is I want you to take your little gums and I want you to go like this and I want you to turn your face and that's happiness. Good job. Okay, now when you're sad, you're going to take your lips and you're going to go like, no, we don't have to do that to kids. They come out crying, right? And when they have gas and when they have some pleasurable experience like drinking milk, they smile. It's a reaction. They don't need to be taught how to express emotion. They just do. We also find that when babies are born blind and have never seen a facial expression, they still have the same expressions for happiness and sadness and anger. These 6 basic emotions are the first to develop in human development. We've kind of established that. The more complex ones do take time to develop. So for example, guilt, shame, embarrassment, pride, these are all things that come later. Little kids, they're not shameful or embarrassed about anything, and they love to embarrass parents, and they don't even know they're embarrassing you, right? They'll come up to somebody and be like, why do you have that on your face, or why are you so ugly? And they don't understand. Okay. They're asking questions. They don't understand what it is to be embarrassed, right? They will pass gas in public and think it's the funniest thing in the whole wide world. Okay. There is no shame and there's no embarrassment at younger ages. And these come later, right? And you also find that other emotions, okay, so the question is shame and embarrassment is taught. So the fact that they can experience shame and embarrassment is not really necessarily taught. What's taught is what to be shameful and embarrassed about. That's culturally driven. So in our culture, in Western culture, we have different things that we're shameful and embarrassed about compared to Eastern cultures. And so the fact that we experience that emotion is innate. But what we are, it's shameful about is really closely tied to culture, to social interaction, and that those more complex emotions are show a little bit less universality, meaning it's more dependent on culture, and it's not something that you're going to see necessarily across the board in other cultures that aren't exposed to each other. Okay, so we know that we're complicated, that humans are complicated, and that emotion is complex and sometimes hard to read. So there are 3 main reasons, and there's lots of little reasons, but 3 main reasons why facial expressions can be difficult to interpret. So why is decoding complicated? Number 1 is affect blends. Just like we saw with the other case of the people I said cover their eyes, cover their mouth. And that is because sometimes different parts of your face can express different emotions. Sometimes we're feeling a certain emotion and we display a different one. And that would be more of like masking sometimes. So you might be really, really sad about something, but you kind of put on a happy face because you don't want the person to feel bad. That is where we get the masking occurred. Some people are really, really good at masking emotions. And sometimes people will put on a face like they're not bothered by something. Like, for example, if they're getting bullied, because they don't want somebody to make it worse and see them cry, right? And then finally, culture is a big reason for this because we have different, what we call display rules. And display rules are those that are dictated by culture. And this is what we're allowed to express and show based on our cultural rules. And so I've got a question. Why are some people more difficult to read than others? And that's because depending on their background and depending where they come from, they may choose, whether intentionally or as a coping mechanism, to have more flat affect or a more neutral face. Some people, you kind of don't really know what they've gone through, and they might not really show a really wide range of emotion on their face, but they may 100% experience it internally. And then others, some people are just less emotional than others, and hormones are involved with that. And there's a lot of biological causes and also personality traits that go into that. We also find too that culture can make it difficult, if we're looking at one culture versus another, to see what cultures deem as appropriate. So for example, what is normally okay for American women in terms of smiling? What is the expectation for American women? When someone smiles at you, smile back. Sure, sure. Has anybody ever been told that they need to smile more? Yeah, if you're not smiling a huge smile, okay, then you are not really smiling, right? If you're just like, okay, you really need to. And so I've had so we've got people here saying yes, they've been told that they need to smile more. This is not necessarily doesn't happen to men, but is much more common in women, that if a woman has, and we call it resting bitch face, which is basically you're just kind of at your neutral, and you look kind of like unapproachable. If you have kind of one of those resting faces, you often probably get told that you should smile more. People, and I've got some in comments here that yes, they're being told that they would look better if they smiled. Some women do report that they get told by people just, you know, what do you, what's wrong with you? Why don't you go ahead and just smile more? Aren't you happy? And the expectation is that American women should be really smiling all of the time. And it's because, you know, you should be pretty and you should be approachable and you should be all of these things. In Japanese culture, it's kind of interesting because it's not an expectation for a woman to walk around with a big smile on her face. What the expectation is actually when you smile is to cover your mouth. It's sort of like, you know, being sort of, bashful, and it's sort of like the expectation for women to cover their smile in Japanese culture. We're also going to talk about here, which this is one of the funniest. I'm going to explain this picture here in a second, but I want to talk about gaze first. We've talked about this a little bit already. When you see somebody who doesn't hold your gaze in American culture, we might find that offensive. We might say that the person is not truthful, they're not confident, that they're hiding something. I don't know if you feel this way, but I often feel uncomfortable if somebody's wearing sunglasses and it covers their eyes and I don't know if they're looking at me. I don't know if they're paying attention to me. If somebody's looking at their phone but they're not looking at you and they're like, I'm listening, it doesn't really feel like they're paying attention to us. And it kind of feels like, you know, oh well, you don't really care what I'm about to say. And so gaze for American culture is really important. There are other cultures who don't like to be looked in the eye, or their gender expectations that are different for gaze. But I'm just kind of focusing on American culture there. Personal space. This is one that I love. Okay. So in America, in the US and in some Western cultures, but specifically in America. Okay. When you're standing in line, what is your bubble? What is your personal bubble? If somebody is less than a foot to you and they're standing very close to your back, what would you do? Would you feel comfortable? Would you feel uncomfortable? Okay, some people say, okay, I would step away. All right. Especially COVID, sure. But before COVID, let's talk about like just kind of culturally. Now you're like, we're social distancing, get away from me. Too close, right? Yeah, we don't come so close to me. What if somebody walks up to you and they're touching you? What if they're like, you know, touching you in line? They're literally like their arm is touching you. Would that make you uncomfortable? So thumbs up if you're standing in line, somebody's standing so close that they are touching you. You might step away, you might turn around and give them a dirty look. I got lots of getting a lot of thumbs up here. I personally would be like, excuse me, can you please not? But yeah, okay. So a lot of people are like, I don't know. You got some stranger coming up and just kind of touching you. This is where this picture comes in. And this is hilarious. Okay. So this is called a matatu. And these are really popular cabs in Kenya. So my husband went to Kenya for a summer. So he's kind of a big guy and, just kind of like, big all over. And so he was riding and he would ride in these matatus going from town to town. Well, as you can see here, there are people hanging out of the van. Okay. And this is like somebody pulls up and everybody jumps in, right? Well, inside, which you can't see, this is not a picture of a matatu that my husband took, but this is a very good example of what it looked like. There are people sitting on each other's laps in the van. Okay. Strangers, just riding from point to point. Okay. And when my husband said he went to Kenya for the first time riding in a matatu, he said he sat down and some man, okay, grown ass man, walked up to him and sat on his lap. And you're like, you're an American. You don't like, your personal, you got a bubble. Okay. When you go to other countries, there are different personal space bubble rules. Okay. And sometimes that is, you'll see a lot of like hand holding. You'll see a lot of people touching shoulders. And there doesn't seem to be much of an issue with some cultures. So it says there's a question, men and women sit on each other's laps too. Is there a boundary? That's a really good question. I'll need to ask him. I definitely got the sense that it was more men sitting on each other's laps just because, but I don't know. I'll have to ask him specifically if women were involved in that as well. And then we have a comment that they had to do this when they were on vacation. It is very awkward for people of different, cultures to have to, kind of abide by these new rules. And then I have another comment here. It feels like a foot away or less for me is more personal, intimate space. If a friend or family member sat that close to me, it'd be fine. But if a stranger stood close, I'd get nervous, especially if it wasn't a big crowd keeping close to me. Yeah. And that's really common, is like, if you know the person, or if you're comfortable with them, if they're a family member or friend, that's okay to be pretty close. But if it's a complete stranger, Americans tend to have a pretty large space bubble compared to other cultures. And even other Western cultures have different space bubble sort of expectations. Smiling is another one that is really common. And we kind of talked about that, where we said that in terms of Japanese culture, women tend to cover their smiles, and American women are more encouraged to smile broadly. And then negative facial expressions. So negative facial expressions, like, for example, in Eastern cultures, like in Japanese, are expected to be sort of covered up with laughter, or not really displayed. And so again, this is a definite difference in culture. Like, it's okay for Americans to have a negative facial expression, but in Japanese, you might see it sort of covered up with smiles, like somebody is experiencing negative emotion, but they're smiling or laughing, but they're not displaying the emotion that they're feeling. And we also see sort of fewer expressions in those Eastern cultures compared to Western cultures. And we also see emblems. So the emblems are, like, for example, nonverbal gestures. So I'm going to give you guys some examples. If you do V for like victory or peace, right? But you do it like this, that's actually offensive in Australia. It's basically giving the middle finger. It was really funny because George W. Bush actually did that out and didn't understand the cultural difference. And he's like, hey, and they're like, why are you giving us the middle finger? That's super offensive. Okay, here. So the okay sign is okay in the US. In Japan, it means money. In France, it means zero. In Mexico, it means sex. And in Ethiopia, it means homosexuality. And in Southern American cultures, it's actually obscene. So for example, Brazil, and I actually did this one time in class with a Brazilian student, and he was like, I can confirm that that is offensive. And I was like, I'm so sorry. So be careful what you do. There's also a couple ones, and this one has actually become a little bit more popular on TikTok, and that's the hand purse. So for years, I've taught this course, and I've been like, this is a gesture in Italy. And everyone's like, okay. But now TikTok is like that's the thing, right? That's a new TikTok trend. So it's kind of fun to see some other cultures' emblems become more popular. But in Tunisia, in Malta, this actually means you may seem good, but you're really bad. That's a very complex meaning for this one sort of hand purse, which I find that very funny. But also very, very enlightening. Another one is head nodding. So in America, this is yes, and this is no. In other cultures, it's reversed. I had a lot of trouble when I was working with a lot of people from India when I worked before graduate school. And so they would come in and I would ask a question and they would go like this, and that meant yes. And they would go like this, and that meant no. So I'd be like, oh, do you understand? And they'd be like, And I'd be like, okay, great, you understand. And they actually were nodding to me, no. That was extremely complicated. And also was like almost like an SNL skit, because I was like, okay, so we're good. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, great. And they were like, and I'm like, I just say yes or no. I don't understand. So it can get complicated, but also that was a very humorous interaction. Okay, so looking at one last real major thing that I want to talk about in class today is the implicit personality theory. And that is because it's such an important theory when understanding how we sort of understand people, right? So implicit personality theory is a schema that we use. And so schemas are shortcuts. These are mental shortcuts to allow us to navigate our environment more quickly. Sometimes these shortcuts are good and sometimes they're bad. Sometimes they can lead us to form incorrect impressions, and sometimes they help us cut corners and they do actually work. So implicit personality theory is essentially that we group certain traits together and we assume that if a person is one trait, that they're all of those traits. So for example, if somebody is generous, we also think that they must also be kind, right? If a person is stingy with money, then they're probably also irritable. These are traits that we tend to group together. And if you're one of these things, then you're probably the whole package. For quick impressions, we have two major schemas that we use: warmth and competence. So warmth is that if a kind, warm person is present, we sort of see them as generous, trustworthy, and helpful. Okay. And then a cold person would be seen as the opposite of those things. And then the second schema is competence. And so a person who's capable and they are like a can-do person, we also tend to see them as dominant and powerful. And then also the opposite is true. So an incompetent person is considered weak. So these are sort of our quick impression forming when we meet people the first time. So the question is this why reserved people are seen as snobby or mean when louder people are automatically seen as friendly or nice? Yeah, these are schemas that we put together, a set of personality traits that we assume are in the same package. And that's what implicit personality theory is all about. And why do we do it? Well, we're trying to understand other people. We're trying to understand their behavior. We want to infer that they have specific traits and feelings and motives to make us judge them faster. And sometimes we're not accurate, right? Sometimes, even though we think that these personality traits go together in one person, sometimes we can be wrong about that. But it is a way for us to make inferences and to form impressions very quickly. And this is culturally specific too. Not the fact that we have implicit personality theory, but the fact that the different traits look different as different packages based on culture. So implicit personality theory goes across all cultures. It's just what kind of package it is differs based on culture. I'll give you a couple of examples. So here, the left is Andy Warhol, and he is a famous artist. He was a famous artist. And so that particular person might be considered creative, intense, temperamental, and unconventional. This is what we kind of see as the creative type, the artistic type, right? Well, in Chinese culture, they don't have this package. They don't have the creative type. They have something called shigu. And shigu is a person who is worldly, devoted to their family, skillful, socially skillful, and reserved. And we don't really have that kind of person in our schemas. And we see that these are basically, these schemas are passed on from generation to generation, and that these are culturally specific. And so we see it kind of changing over time. So looking at American culture, another package that we have is what is beautiful is good. And so if a person is attractive, that they have a lot of other attractive qualities. This is a typical a package that we see in American culture. In Chinese culture, there's a traditional Chinese values package called Renqun, which is focused on relationships, creating and maintaining interpersonal harmony, inner harmony. And we don't really, as Americans, have something that fits that particular package. Okay. The final thing that I want to talk about is something that we had talked a little bit about at the beginning of the semester, and that is Heider's attribution theory. He's considered the father of attribution theory because he believed in this, what he referred to as naive or common sense psychology, that we all as humans are very curious creatures. We're trying to understand people and put them together. And so what we do is that we infer how people act based off of their attributes, like what makes them who they are. And this can be problematic sometimes because this can be where stereotypes come from, because we group people together in boxes. So for example, if you see a homeless person, if you look at this person and see that the cause of their condition is because of an internal set of attributes, internal factors, they're lazy, they're drug addicted, they did this to themselves, then that could be making a fundamental error about this person. We need to consider external factors. For example, did this person lose their job? Did they have something happen to them where that's causing their condition? So that would be an external attribution. And it turns out that we have choices. We can look at somebody and say, the reason why they're acting the way that they are is because of who they are and their character. Or we can look at a person and say that they are who they are because of certain situational factors. And if we make an error and assume that it's because of internal factors, like calling somebody a jerk for acting a certain way, when actually they're fine, they're a nice person, but their external situation causes them to act inappropriately, then we're making what we refer to as the fundamental attribution error. And this can be problematic because if we're having this error, we're not respecting people's actual attributes, which actually might be kind. Okay, we're just